in your experience of other people who have had an experience of enlightenment, would you say that that is a death, that moment? As in, is it they're like dying before they're dying, or their character is dying before they're dying?
Again, I can answer it, but you have to be really careful of the words I'm using, because it can't be answered. Because we use this word enlightenment as if it's a thing. And if that other label we use as death is another thing. And we're asking then, are those two things related? Well, fundamentally what this says is that there are no things. So from that fundamental isness, there is no point in time and space which is a thing that can be labeled enlightenment. And likewise, there is no point in time and space that there is a thing that can be labeled the death of a thing. We use these as almost shorthands for ease of mapping and for ease of movement, basically. The ease of being able to map, to create a map. And maps are fundamentally don't have to be true, they just have to be useful. And we tend to use them. That's the prime assessment of a map. Is it useful? If it's useful, we retain it, share it, and try to enhance it through our sharing to make it more accurate. In that sense, we make hopefully lots and lots of micro errors, and we sort of error correct without making a fatal error, which then it's not easy to error correct. And that goes for the is fractal, no matter what scale you're looking at that on, whether you label it as an individual scale or a society scale, it's still the same error correction that's being played out, because fundamentally we know we live in uncertainty in the sense that we can never know everything. There is simply too much information that we can process, and we don't have the resources, the energetic resources to process that in a way that's efficient and quick enough to be useful for movement, which is useful for like we spoke about before, those two fundamental needs to move, and when you move, don't die. So the time input into that computation, as it were, is critical. Just from a standalone time perspective, and also from an energy resource perspective of the individual or of the group. They're both limited, and time is more often than not a critical input into that decision making. So again, these are all models, and within a model, a particular type of model, they use a label called enlightenment in certain models. So it's a utility label, and to a certain extent it's a poetic label, because many traditions and characters will speak and use these words like poetry in an effort to try to to approach something which can't be approached, or to contain something which can't be contained, like put into a box and labeled as enlightenment, as a thing, basically. What's fundamentally said is that there is no thing. So as soon as we start a conversation talking about like independent, separate things, we're in, fundamentally Alice in Wonderland world. Where, rephrasing that question, you can almost ask, does the pink elephant get enlightened? Well, fundamentally, there is no pink elephant to get or find another thing which is enlightenment, or indeed not enlightenment. It's prior to all those sort of models, all those sort of measurements, all those sort of contrasts, all those sort of relationships, all those extremes, really, the extremes inherent in duality. Because again, something which is so beautifully immeasurable, in which there is no gap, the character, the physiology, the five senses, out of utility, creates a hugely simplified interpretation out of utility, out of necessity, of complexity into a simplicity which is like a straight line in which we can put extremes. One side in the question, enlightenment, another side, non-enlightenment, or a subject and an object. In a sense, these are all just simplified, extreme parameters to make sense, to be able to create a contrast, to make a utilitarian sense of how to move. So another question would be, irrespective of the movement, irrespective of if it's a physiological movement, an emotional movement, a psychological movement, is what happens if there's a movement, but there is no separate something which is a mover. It's like, let's go back, often people use these terms, first principles. Let's get right back to the root. Using that word, in a sense, this is very radical, in a good sense of where radical means get to the root of. We've already, in a sense, spread out into duality, into a multitude of opposites, of relationships. And it's like, whoa, come back, right to the basics, the fundamental building block, as it were. Which is there if there's movement, or indeed if there's no movement. Again, two other extreme labels. The possibility is that there is no independent, no separate identity thing. So then the question collapses. And it brings down the whole of duality, in a sense, the whole edifice. you could say, sometimes I use the word it crumbles, but it sort of like projects the idea that, again, there's a thing that can crumble. It's has more of a flavor of, it becomes the duality, the apparent duality becomes, again, careful of my words, becomes transparent. It's becomes self-evident that there is no independent thing, or from the perspective of the character, there's no independent something called a me, which is moving. And yet there's the appearance, the real appearance of movement. And that there's no gap between the fundamental isness and the apparent movement. They are not two. It's eventually the questions just hit a brick wall in a way. They can go so far, and like we've spoken about before, they're just an inappropriate tool to use at the end of the day, talking about this subject. And it's, from this point of view, it's like, it can be fun. It's like eating a meal. It's sort of enjoyable. It's sharing. It's fun. It's playful. But at some point, if you ask me then to eat another meal straight after the first meal, the body would want to, like, almost like vomit. So you, in this context, using words or talking like this is fun and frustrating and all these different emotions. But at some point, my character will just not want to speak anymore because it'll find it like, it's like, because we're going round in loops, basically. And you can loop for, for seconds, for minutes, for months, for years.
You could loop for years without it feeling ugh, and it be completely okay.
Yeah, there can be a confusion or an unsurety about this subject, or there could be a great intellectual clarity about this subject. But it's still in a loop. There's just an angst that's confused, or an angst that has clarity. Because it's, whoa, we're talking about something which, again, careful of my words, is prior to the movement. It's not relational to the movement. It's not relational to a label called enlightenment or a label called non-enlightenment. It's not relational to a label called form or a label called the formless. It's not relational to a label called the past or a label called the future. It's not relational to a label called a thing and a label called a not thing. It's immeasurable. It's edgeless.